So today we have coffee with Joe Henrich from Harvard University. So he is an anthropologist, I think, originally. He has worked a lot with economists and other computer science people, and is now, I think, head of the Human Evolutionary Biology department at Harvard. So he's well known for his work on human development and diversity in human development. And what fascinates me is, the enormous use of all types of data available. Standard data that, big data sets that we, like economists are using, but also other types of data collected by anthropologists, psychology, economists, historian. So this combination has, is fascinating me a lot. And recently he has issued a book called The Weir People, basically the difference between the West and the rest. And that is what you will give your keynote talk on. So, with this brief presentation, I want to ask you, what is the main message of that book and your presentation?
Yeah, so the book really begins with the observation that there's a great deal of psychological diversity around the world and all kinds of dimensions that have largely gone unrecognized. So throughout the history of behavioral economics, as well as the discipline of psychology, most of the sampling has been either university students or people from Western societies. Americans in particular have dominated the samples. But whenever we look elsewhere in the world, we find interesting patterns of diversity. So societies vary in things like individualism, how people think about themselves, their inclination to help strangers versus members of their own family. We've seen talks about that at this conference already. And analytic thinking versus holistic thinking, whether people use intentions and moral judgments. So there's all these interesting patterns of diversity. And so really what I'm focused on in the book is figuring out a way to explain that variation. And one of the things that came out of our initial review of the available data is that not only were European descent populations, the populations we call WEIRD, which is an acronym that stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic, one slice of cultural diversity. They were actually at the extreme end of distribution, so they're not a representative slice at all. So in the book, I'm trying to explain this psychological variation and where it came about, and particularly like how it emerged in Europe and when, and that kind of thing. And so one of the key elements in my story is the spread of a particular brand of Christianity during the Middle Ages, what eventually evolves into the Roman Catholic Church. And as the church spreads through Europe, it begins to dissolve the tribal patterns and the extended kin networks that characterize so many different societies, and particularly including those in Europe. And so by the beginning of the High Middle Ages, at least some European populations are broken down into monogamous nuclear families. And I make the case that this gives rise to new forms of social organization, so the emergence of voluntary associations. So guilds and universities and charter towns begin to spread in places like Germany and France and England and whatnot. And that these new institutions then have subsequent effects on psychology. So it's a process that takes, 800 years or something. Towards the end of the book, I try to tackle the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, so I noticed that. And one thing that I find very interesting, so you're focusing on cultural differences and not genetic differences, right, which is different from some of the other explanations.
Yeah, and so towards the end of the book, I want to take on those other explanations because, I'm in the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. We take genes and genetic evolution very seriously. And my prior book, The Secret of Our Success, made the case that a lot of human physiology and anatomy can only be understood as a product of as gene culture coevolution. So for example, if you look at our intestines and our teeth, they only make sense as a species that makes fire and does cooking. So those aspects of our physiology are only explained by fire, and fire is culturally transmitted. So it's a piece of culture that's been around long enough, say around 1 million years, to shape our physiology and anatomy. So it's not implausible that institutions or technologies could shape our genes. So in the book, I make the case that in the case of Europe, did any of these institutions affect the genes? And one of the interesting historical patterns that makes that quite unlikely, in fact, it may have gone in the opposite direction, is that as people cluster, so Europe begins urbanizing, sometime commercial revolution hits around 1900, people begin moving into these charter towns. These towns and cities are increasingly hit by diseases. So if we imagine a selection effect where people have psychological inclinations to be more individualistic, so they want to move to the towns are basically death traps. And they're only preserved at growing populations because there's so much migration from the hinterworlds. So if anything, you would expect the opposite, selection against these traits.
Yeah, so that is also very interesting that, culture affects, the genes.
The genome, yeah. And there's other evidence against it too that I marshal in the book. So if you look at second-generation immigrants to the U.S. and then third-generation immigrants, people from all around the world have migrated to the U.S. We can detect in second-generation immigrants the places where they came from, but the ability to detect that disappears quickly. Third generation, fourth, it's basically invisible. So that again suggests no reason to think there's genes involved.
I mean, there are other books about human development, focusing on other things, germs, steels, and guns, for instance, focusing on natural resources.
Right.
So how do you think about that?
Yeah, so in The Weirdest People in the World, I take on the Guns, Germs, and Steel, which I think is a fantastic book, and I think it gets a big part of the story. Yeah. The way I pose it, if you look at the world in the year 1000, you would think that the society that might have the breakthrough of the Industrial Revolution or develop science would be, you might think it's the Islamic world, China, or maybe India. And if you look at the writings, and I put a few of these in the book, they're kind of fun, it has Islamic scholars talking about the black barbarians to the south and the white barbarians to the north, referring to sub-Saharan Africans and then to, the Dutch maybe in the English and folks like that, the white barbarians. But so that, Europe looks like Northern Europe looks very much like a backwater at this point in history. So it's really that 1,000-year period when there's a reversal of fortunes, and it's actually a shorter portion of that. So then the question is, why did that change occur in that 1,000 years? And I don't think Jared Diamond is very good at explaining that. I think the Guns, Germs, and Steel story, which has to do with the distribution of plants and animals around the globe, really tells you why you would expect it in Eurasia. Yeah. So the Middle East, the Yellow River Valley, places like that are well endowed with seed resources and animal resources, much more so than Oceania, Papua New Guinea, Australia, places like that, so the New World. So we should expect to see it within Eurasia. It doesn't do a good job of telling you why Northern Europe is where the Industrial Revolution occurred.
Interesting. So how do you think about, Darren Acemoglu's and Robinson's book, which sort of focuses on institutional differences?
Yeah, so one of the ways you can kind of put the two books together is to think about, they talk about the pluralistic institutions, but you need to know where those institutions came from. Yeah. So for example, if you look at the origins of democratic institutions, communes, they begin to pop up in Europe, say after about the year 1000, when this new form of psychology that I talk about is gestating. You're getting, some families have been rearranged and whatnot. But at the same time, Islamic cities, there's lots of Islamic cities, and none of those adopt representative governments. So whatever your story is, you have Islamic towns right near European towns, these adopt representative assemblies, none of these do. So there's clearly some kind of cultural milieu. And I try to make the case that people's ways of thinking and the fact that they're individuals make them more likely to prefer certain kinds of institutions. And then you can see that in the modern world. Jonathan Schultz, an economist at George Mason, has a paper trying to explain preferences for democracy and the emergence of these communes, using the idea that the church rearranged the family system, and then that led to these downstream effects. So, I mean, what I would say so I've co-taught at Harvard with Jim Robinson, and I know Daron quite well. The argument is always, where do those things come from? And also the other thing is their notion of institutions embeds all this cultural stuff. So it's not just the stuff we can write in the Charter or the Constitution. It's all kinds of inchoate norms about constraints on the executive and things like that lead to make those institutions effective. And where you can see that is all the cases where we've taken the British parliamentary system and plopped it down in different parts of the world, and it hasn't functioned like it did in England.
Which I think is also a very important message in your book. But there are some paradoxes, north and south of Italy, they're different.
Right. Yeah, so that's one of our favorite cases, because people often think of Italy, their reaction is, well, Italy's all Catholic, so shouldn't this theory apply the same in all of Italy? But what they don't realize is that northern and southern Italy has very different history. So northern Italy is under the Carolingian Empire. So this is the year 800, and the Carolingians have teamed up with the church to impose this church's marriage and family program. so Milan and the cities of the Renaissance and whatnot get the full force of the European marriage program. So they start this program early, the same time that Western Germany gets it, and parts of France and southern England. But southern Italy is a patchwork of polities, including some governed by Islamic powers and others under the Greek Orthodox Church. So places like Sicily, they don't begin down this road until much later than other parts. And what we can do is we can look at, say, rates of cousin marriage in different Italian provinces. And we can predict things like trust in strangers or voluntary blood donations to strangers, and explain the variation in Italy using this idea.
Which is also fascinating, using all types of data to support yours. So,
right. Yeah. So as you mentioned in your intro, there's behavioral economic data, which is really powerful because it's precise, but then you worry about how much it generalizes. So we have the blood donation data. We use tools from psychology, where psychologists ask you a lot of questions and come up with a measure of individualism. So, I want to see a converging story from all those different kinds of data.
Maybe another paradox is that, Northern Europe, the Scandinavian countries, they were not conquered by the Carolingian Empire.
Right.
The Vikings stood against, at least for 200 years.
So Scandinavia is an interesting case because, one, they were probably more individualistic in the period because of the lifestyle. So, governed by these kind of Viking societies, but then when they eventually get Protestantism is kind of like a souped-up version of Catholicism. It actually embodies you can actually get to heaven on faith alone. That's really about mental states. It's about you, the individual. There's not a lot of church. And so that that gets. I think that's part of the Scandinavian story.
Yeah. So it happened, but it happened a little later. Yeah. So how did you come up with this research agenda?
So it started. So in the 2000s, I was putting together this paper called "The Weirdest People in the World," where we review all this evidence to show this variation. That's mostly a methodological concern. It's saying that, look, we're generalizing too much from these samples, and they're unusual, and the textbooks and even handbooks in economics will talk about humans behaving a certain way, and it turns out to be just this thin slice. But then that was very unsatisfying to me because I wanted to be able to explain the variation. So, I didn't have an explanation off the top of my head, so I started reading European history. And one of the people I read was an anthropologist, actually, named Jack Goody. And he had been doing ethnographic field work in Africa. And it just struck him the contrast between European families and African families. And he knew from his field work how much kinship mattered in these African societies. So then he's like, well, what happened to why is kinship in Europe the way it is? And so then he began digging into it. And he never really got interested in the psychological side, which is where I came in, but he had identified the family idea. And then I just said, well, maybe the families are connected to the psychology, and that's a link in the chain. And so now, what I'm going to talk about tomorrow is that institutions and psychology co-evolve. So institutions here broadly considering social norms and all kinds of things. So not exactly what Daron would say. Well, maybe. Daron's kind of, I feel like we've converged. But institutions in a sense which includes culture co-evolves with our psychology.
Interesting. So, so what do you think are the gaps in this, what should I say, research project you have?
The biggest gap frustration I had when I was writing the book is that I had to use a lot of contemporary psychological data. There's a few times when I can, I use Gregory Clark's work, and he's able to get measures of maybe patience, maybe it's temporal discounting. He gets it from interest rates, which he has to infer from land rents and things like that. So I use that, and I try to make use of it. I look at homicide because we have good data on homicide going deep. And so, maybe those are kind of proxies, but I really didn't have good psychological data. So what I've been trying to do in my lab is put together a team to think about how we can extract psychological measures from textual data. Right. So I have two different groups. I have one group that's focusing on English, using U.S. newspapers, basically. And, with British newspapers, maybe we can go back 300 years and get good spatial coverage and temporal coverage. And we use these techniques, like a simple version would be like a word bag. So people who are more individualistic tend to use certain words. They might use I a lot. They might not use the royal we as much. And then there's a number of different psychological concepts which there are these word bags for. Now we're trying to go a little bit more sophisticated than that, but as a first pass, you can run these word bags and you can get temporal and spatial variation on these different dimensions of. So like Ben Anke at this conference has been talking about moral universalism. So we can measure that with a word bag, and we get temporal and spatial variation. Now the big game, though, is doing this in the Latin corpora. So my lab now includes Latin scholars and historians and stuff. And so we're trying to do basically digital humanities, extract psychological measures from Latin texts. And if we get that, then we can go back 2,000 years or more in the Latin corpora. And then I want to see changes through time in different places.
So another thing that also interests me is that, the way you do research. I mean, it used to be that in the humanities and the social sciences, it was, one researcher with a pencil in his office. But you have a lab now, or like, much more like the real sciences. So, and where do you see yourself, organizing research, let's say 10 years from now? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. So I happen to have been very lucky in being able to get into a situation where I'm able to attract scholars. So my lab also includes economists. We've had religious studies scholars. We have a psychologist, and just bringing everyone together. And they're able to pull in ideas from their own disciplines and go after whatever our question is. It's interesting that the humanities hasn't responded to the availability of all this digital. I mean, they're kind of interested, but like one fun thing I've been looking at is if you look at co-authorships in the sciences, the number of co-authors on papers has been increasing for several decades, except in the humanities it's totally flat. Hasn't changed at all.
Also social sciences, you see the same value, I guess you are social science then. So, okay, I think I thank you very much. I mean, very interesting.
Good to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.